my whole life before something like 10, 15 years ago. I can't remember exactly how long it was I was on income assistance, but but before I got on that system, I lived my whole life before that thinking that I would never someday be on a system as such as income assistance for the Department of Community Services. And surprise, surprise, the point in my life came where it ended up happening. I felt that I was in a transition at that point in my life from being financially better off to only receiving, and now the allowance is $810, but when I first started receiving it, it was a lot less. I was receiving like $505 a month when I first started receiving it, and then I was living in a rooming house at that point. And the transition in my personal life from better income to low income, and then my income getting a little better but not by much as time went on, that was the biggest experience for me, was the transition that was involved. When you don't have a lot of money to do social things in the community, that means you don't have a lot of money to do social things in the community. Rent has to be paid. The power bill has to be paid. The phone bill has to be paid. Now, something I want to point out about paying the phone bill, when I first got on assistance, for the first few years, they would not qualify me for a phone because when I was living in a rooming house, even if I had have gotten a note from my doctor, they would not have qualified me because they had me down as already having access to a phone. But after I got my own apartment and the doctor filled out the disability form and said I needed a phone for medical reasons, I did qualify for a phone then. So starting at that point, like 3 years later, that's when I did start getting an extra $35 on my check. Now, the experience of finally getting the telephone allowance, that did me a lot. Once I got my phone, I had a way of keeping in contact with people. It opened up the door for me to be able to start looking for my next job and stuff. Mm-hmm. So it did me some good more than harm, yeah. Before I moved into my apartment, I never thought I would someday myself be using the services of places like food banks, soup kitchens, the various drop-in places where poor people go. But I don't use those places now. Well, I still go to the food bank, the odd visit, but I had successfully the last couple of years not have any reason to use the drop-ins and the soup kitchens. But there was a period of time in my life a few years back where I did have reason to use those places. And that's where I got to see the whole community of people that are on assistance. And I've gotten to realize that meeting a lot of those people, their situations were worse off than mine. I mean, my situation and their situation had the financial part in common, but when it comes to the relationships with family and friends, I have a good relationship with my family. Now, for a lot of them, they don't. $535 is the shelter allowance, but for some people who are on income assistance, like $535 is only in certain situations. For some people, like if you're boarding or if you're on the system as being able to work, then $300 is the limited shelter allowance for those people. And then you get a personal allowance of $275, and that's in both programs, the disability and the regular. And anyway, the thing is because of the little bit of amount of money that people get, there's a lot people on assistance, they basically can't afford to pay rent. They're paying above and beyond what they receive for shelter allowance in order to cover rent and power bill. Now, the way Community Services looks at it, what has to be included within the $535 that they allow has to be the rental of your actual apartment, heat, hot water, and power all has to be included with that $535. And if your rent before power bill is $535, then in those cases, people are paying like whatever their rent is plus power bill, and that's going over the $535 shelter allowance, and they're dipping into their $275 personal allowance to top up their power bill and their rent. Financially better off people, they have lots of opportunity to live their lives not feeling socially isolated, and income assistance recipients not so much. I mean, the thing is the best way I can put it is, okay, for starters, 90% is a safe number to give here of financially better off people are married, they have families. That right there speaks volumes as to why a financially better off adult couple, they can go home after their jobs and spend their evenings at home not feeling isolated because they're spending time together as a couple with their kids. That's what a married couple with kids does. Now, when you're on income assistance, and especially when you get on it while you're so young, and I was in my 20s when I got on it, you are discouraged from living your life having that type of relationship. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that income assistance does to people, that downgrades them. Now, one way that the system needs to improve is people on income assistance, if they want to stop living their lives feeling discouraged from having that type of relationship, an intimate relationship, community services got to change their cohabitation policies. Because right now, if you're living together in an apartment as a common law couple and on income assistance, you're going to lose quite a bit of money from your assistance. You're going to get a shelter allowance of $570, and that's for the couple living together in the apartment, the same as the $535, but again, it has to cover rent of the apartment and all bills. So that's how the system discourages things like dating, living life with having intimate partners and stuff like that. And one example that I can use is for financially better off people. There's a lot of adult sports teams offered through Sports Nova Scotia. And I know a guy who's on income assistance who would love to join an ice hockey team, but what is provoking him is the fact that when you only receive $810 a month to live on, you can't afford the expensive registration fee to be able to do something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's what's stopping the guy I know, who's a guy who I know in the community, from joining an ice hockey team. Now, if a financially better off person wanted to join an ice hockey team, they would have no problem because they have money to pay registration fees for stuff like that. First, I want to point out the really good changes that has happened within the past couple of months for the better. This work incentive I just mentioned, that only started in October. Before that, I was only allowed to keep $300 a month, and straight 70% after $300 got taken off my check. Now, after the first $350, it's a sliding scale. So that in itself was a good change right there. Now, the ones who are able to work, I want to point out, before October, they were only allowed to keep the first $150 a month. Like, in the system for $350, they call that supportive employment, and they call the other regular employment. Now, they're now allowed to make $250 a month, so that one change already happened. Second, single moms who receive child support, starting the 1st of August, their child support payments stop getting clawed back from their checks. And the other positive change is now if you live within the Metro Halifax-Dartmouth area, you get this free bus pass, which people on income assistance are entitled to. Like, before they started issuing these in July, before July of last year, people were getting a transportation allowance, and not every income assistance recipient qualified for that. It was if you had a disability and if you need it for work, training, or having a minimum of 12 appointments per month. So those free bus passes eliminated the bureaucratic nonsense of whether it's your doctor saying you have 12 appointments a month, or having a part-time job just to get funded for a bus pass, or going to a training program. Now, there's still a lot beyond what has happened, of course, that does need to change about the system.
Okay.
First, the cohabitation policies. The second thing that needs to change is they got to eliminate the requirements for a medical note from a doctor in order to get a telephone, because again, communication with people is a God-given right. They got to change the policy that requires doctors to write doctor's notes for telephone, saying that you need a telephone for a medical reason. And another reason I point out why this needs to change is because I know a few income assistance recipients out there in the community. That's the one thing that's stopping them from looking for work, because they actually want to look at re-entering the workforce. Mm-hmm. But because they don't have telephones where they can get contacted by potential employers, means that they can't be out in the workforce, out in the world looking for work. Mm-hmm. And something else that's got to change: when you receive income assistance, and say if you lose a job, you're entitled to so many weeks of employment insurance. That gets clawed back at 100%. Because employment insurance is something you contribute to while you're working, that's got to get treated at least the same as wages from employment. Mm-hmm. Same, and so does wages from self-employment. That's got to get changed to be treated like wages from employment. Section 6.3.3 of the policy manual, you'll see that there's 3 columns on that page. The first column is the name of the special diet that they're funding, and then the middle column, that describes what, according to Department of Community Services, the medical reasoning as to why someone who should be receiving that special diet should be or is receiving it. And then the third column is the approved allowance amount that's that diet, like that they will pay for, like that they'll put on your check to cover that diet. I've had this experience myself where my doctor came to the decision that he's no longer going to be supporting the expectations of my caseworker because of that part of the policy. And doctors know that even though those medical reasons yet have truth to them, there's other medical reasons out there that's not mentioned in that middle column as to why people need those diets. But anyway, that part of the policy, and there's also a section in the regulations that if a caseworker decides that they're not going to accept a medical note up front, they're going to call and further to question the doctor, and there's something in the regulations that allows that to happen. Now, in my case, and in the cases of a few others I know, the doctors did get harassed by the caseworkers because the caseworkers called after they decided they could not accept a certain medical note at face value, and the doctors got questioned to the point where they got stretched to the medical limits of what they could say. Well, the reality is, from everything I've been seeing about a basic income, I can see the answer being 60% yes, it would change things for the better, but 40% not so sure is how I see the answer to a basic income. And where the 40% not so sure is coming from is basically thinking about what the reality of how much money a basic income check would be on a basic income check. And I've heard different figures of what that amount could look like. I've heard $1,800 a month. I've heard $2,500 a month. I've heard $3,500 a month. I heard loads of 3 sample figures as to what the amount could look like. And where the 40% not so sure is coming from is, would the amount we'd be getting on a basic income, would that be an amount that would allow us to pay rent, pay the bills, and buy groceries and do social things in the community that gets us out of social isolation? Now, if the expenses of all four could be covered on the amount that we receive on a basic income check, then in that case it would be 100% better than the current system we have.
Why?
Because whether it's $1,800 a month or $2,500 a month or $3,000 a month, which is the figures that I've heard that a basic income could be, but the reality is until the basic income is implemented, we don't know what the amount is we're going to receive on a basic income check. Those amounts is a good jump from the current $810 a month that we're currently receiving. The thing is people need to live before they can pursue things like gaining, whether it's part-time employment or full-time employment, going back to school, getting out in their community, doing volunteer work. People need to live.